Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Allison Satter, and I'd like to welcome you to the SWIFT webinar, The Importance of Systematic Screening Using Data to Support School Success. And this is part one of a two-part series, so we hope that you'll join us again on Wednesday, September 21st at 1 o'clock Central for part two of this series. We're so glad that you could join us today. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few of the logistics. For this webinar, we're only providing online access. If you have any feedback or questions throughout, you can list them in the chat box. We will attempt to address them throughout, or else we'll save them at the end, where we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions for Kathleen at the end of the webinar. Also, just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on swiftschools.org after the presentation. We are so excited today to have Dr. Kathleen Lane with us. Kathleen Lane is a professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Kansas. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Lane served as a classroom teacher of general and special education students for 5 years, and as a program specialist for 2 years. Dr. Lane's research interests focus on school-based intervention academic and behavioral. With students at risk for emotional and behavioral disorders. disorders, with an emphasis on systematic screening to detect students with behavioral challenges at the earliest possible juncture. She has designed, implemented, and evaluated comprehensive integrated three-tiered models of prevention in elementary, middle, and high school settings to prevent the development of learning and behavioral challenges and respond to existing instances. Dr. Lane served as the primary investigator of state funded and federally funded projects, and she is also the co-editor of remedial and special education and the Journal of Positive Behavioral Interventions. Dr. Lane has co-authored 7 books and published over 150 reference journal articles and 31 chapters. So you've been busy.
Means I have very limited social skills.
Yeah. Well, we're very honored to have you today. So thank you very, very much, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Allison. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to first just start by applauding you all for your time that you're committing to the work you're doing through the Swift Center. And I want to thank you for your interest in systematic screening. And so as we move forward today, we are going to have an opportunity to go through a whole series of different types of screening tools. And today in our in this first session, we're going to start by talking about some some logistics. Of these screening tools, and then we are going to review some of the available screening tools at this time. And then the next time we're together, we'll be talking about how to use these data as part of regular school practices to inform instruction. Extremely informal, so we will, of course, welcome all your chats as we move through today's webinar, and we'll also have some time at the end of every single screening tool introduced for you to pose questions and ask for any kind of clarification. So as we get started, I really want to applaud each of you for making a firm commitment to all students. Many times, and my work with pre-service teachers, when I've talked about systematic screening, in the year early years, many of them would say, you know, my plan is to become mainly a general education teacher. I'm not going to need to know anything about behavioral challenges or social skills, because I'm going to teach kids that are, you know, general education students. And a big part of me wants to just tell them, you know, honey, have a seat, because when kids come to school, they come as is. You know, they come with their academic skills and challenges. They come with social skills, strengths, and areas that need improvement. And those competencies that they bring to the classroom are very, very important in terms of how they negotiate their relationships with teachers and with peers. And so much of school is social that we need to have those skill sets to make sure that we can successfully negotiate the entire school day. And some kids come, you know, with a lot of different behavioral excesses or deficits as well as strengths. So for example, we're going to have some kids in our community that, you know, they're there all the time. They're never sick. They struggle with a lot of acting out behaviors, and they oftentimes engage in behaviors that make it challenging for teachers to teach, particularly in inclusive environments when we're working really hard to accommodate the multiple students' different needs. And fortunately, those kids' behavior patterns is often very, very simple to detect because of the overt nature of their behavior. But there's another pocket of students that have internalizing issues, and those kids tend to have more, you know, shy, anxious, and withdrawn. And unless we're systematically looking for those children, those are the ones I often worry the most about as a researcher and as a mother, because their behaviors are not going to do things that are going to capture our attention. But kids that have internalizing or externalizing or both types of behavior challenges, we need to know that as teachers so that it can help inform how we support those students. And when we think about you know, the kids that we work with on a regular basis, you know, there's this common misunderstanding that kids that have behavior challenges are going to wind up being in special education and they're going to be supported through an IEP. And I want to respectfully point out that if you look at all the point prevalence estimates right now that are currently available, that is absolutely simply not the case. There's a very small percentage of children that actually go on to receive special education services due to emotional and behavior disorders. But there was a really nice study done not too long ago by Steve Forness, and they were looking at point prevalence estimates. And if you were to take a snapshot, like a picture in public school system, you would find that approximately 12% of school-age kids at that moment in time have between moderate to severe emotional and behavior challenges, and as much as 20% of school-age kids had mild to severe challenges. So it is really important that all of us that are committed to all students be empowered by this idea of systematic screening, that we truly do want to look for kids that may need more than what Tier 1 efforts have to offer. So if you could kind of keep that in mind as we move through that, that'll be important. And the good news for us is that, you know, we've seen this huge shift towards a systems perspective. Rather than treating each child as having, you know, if they have a behavior challenge, kind of give the impression that this is a within child problem and that they need to be managed separately or outside the system. Right now, we're really working collaboratively, you know, between the general education and special education communities to better support kids' academic, behavior, and social needs. And in 2014, I was so impressed. Michael Uden actually gave a keynote address at the PBIS Implementers Forum in Rosemont, Illinois, and he made such a clear and important call that we attend as much to students' social and behavioral needs as we do their academics, and that is 100% spot on. And even here in the state of Kansas, our Commissioner of Education, Randy Watson, he did a listening tour across all of Kansas, and the overwhelming theme that kept coming back from employers was that many kids that were graduating simply did not yet have the soft skills that they needed to successfully negotiate relationships even into employment. So it is important that as we think about kids being future ready, we want to make sure that we are attending to their multiple needs. So I want us to move forward with our commitment to all kids, focusing on meeting all kids' academic, behavioral, and social needs. And some of you might have heard me talk previously about working within the context of comprehensive, integrated, three-tiered models of prevention, which we call CI3T. But that is the whole purpose for these models, is that we want to work with people to make sure that we have clarity in terms of what is expected for everybody, for what teachers need to know, what administrators need to know, what parents need to know, what students need to know about the plan for meeting their academic needs. And the same thing as we think about helping schools to pick, you know, validated social skills curricula, teaching that tier, you know, at Tier 1, so that we're essentially leveling the playing field for all students. And then working clearly and, you know, diligently with a positive behavior intervention and support framework, so that we are explicitly giving kids opportunities to practice and receive reinforcement for meeting those behavioral expectations that facilitate not just strong classroom experiences, but really unlock that students' potential to become self-regulated lifelong learners. And when we think about that whole thing at Tier 1, even if we're in schools that have that in place, and you have it in place with High-fidelity, if you're teaching your social skills and weaving those important lessons into your instruction, and even if we have, you know, very clearly articulated expectations, visible, posted, kids being reinforced for meeting those expectations, there will absolutely still be some students that need more than Tier 1 has to offer. And I want to be really clear in saying that, you know, non-responsiveness to Tier 1 is not a tragedy. It is an expectation. There are going to be some kids like me that, you know, needed one more example of how to use a protractor. There's going to be other kids that no matter how many times you've told them how to be, you know, walk in the hallway and what your expectations are, they may need more than that. There are going to be some kids that, despite your best efforts at Tier 1, they're going to need more opportunity to, you know, learn social skills more intensely. So in these tiered systems, whether it's a CI3T model or a PBIS model or an MTSS model, we want to have a clear way for us to look to see who might need more than Tier 1 has to offer. And so to do that, we want to systematically look for students that might have Tier 2 or Tier 3 needs. And let me be also 100% clear in saying there are no Tier 2 students or Tier 3 students. And that students that are getting Tier 3 supports, those are not necessarily kids only on an IEP. When we think about this model, we're thinking about supporting all kids' multiple needs. And in order to do this, you know, historically, many people have relied predominantly on office discipline referrals. And so if kids had earned between 0 and 1 office discipline referrals, And then basically we made the assumption that their needs were being met within the Tier 1 framework. If students were earning between 2 and 5, we were thinking about Tier 2 needs and wanting to connect with them with evidence-based practices at Tier 2. And if they had earned 6 or more, then you're looking at potentially supporting them with Tier 3 support. So where it might be check-in, check-out at Tier 2, it might be functional assessment-based interventions at Tier 3. And those are points we'll talk about more when we're together later this month. But if we don't screen using systematic screening tools, we are waiting for kids to earn office discipline referrals to connect them to these extra supports. And frankly, I have two really big concerns about that. Unless you go to really important links to make sure that the data you're collecting on office discipline referral is reliable and accurate, we might be missing kids that need help. And even if you do have those systems in place, you're still waiting for them to earn X number of office discipline referrals before we connect them with those extra supports. So the benefit of systematic screening is that we're actually going to look 3 times a year to see who might have additional needs, and that is particularly important for our students with internalizing behavior challenges, because the work of Kent McIntosh has taught us that those kids are not going to be earning office discipline referrals. And if we don't systematically screening, screen for them, we will actually overlook those students. So when we're thinking about Tier 1, I applaud the work that you're doing at Tier 1. And to that practice, I would encourage you to think very intentionally about what people do need to know about their charge in terms of academic responsibilities. They're charged with positive behavior interventions and supports. And thinking carefully about what is your plan for, teaching a validated social skills curriculum. And at Tier 1, it's not just about screening. It's also about making sure that you've got high-fidelity Tier 1 practices. So, for example, when you're making decisions as to how you're going to address students' core academic needs, at Tier 1, we want to level the playing field for everybody, for teachers, for parents, for students, and we want to make it very transparent as to what can I expect. So as a faculty or staff, what's my role in terms of allocating 135 minutes a day for English and language arts. Also, many schools are being much more intentional about, at Tier 1, using wonderful strategies like active supervision, pre-correction, instructional feedback, building an instructional choice, increasing kids' opportunities to respond, and using behavior-specific praise. And when we link back to these strategies the next time we're together, I want to be really clear. We expect these things to be in place at Tier 1. And we want to have, as part of our PBIS components, in addition to that clarity of expectations, we also want to be very clear on how we're going to respond when kids need, have rule infractions. And when they are struggling, we want to keep instruction moving forward. We want to recognize kids who are around them that are being successful in meeting expectations. We want to have really positive teacher-student interaction. And that same is true when we're supporting the introduction of the school-wide social skills component. To make sure that we're ensuring that every single student gets access to all this experience at Tier 1, because part of closing gaps in achievement for different groups of kids is going to be closing these gaps in access to Tier 1 elements. So once this is built, we want to teach the whole thing. So address these academic, behavior, and social needs. We want to reinforce kids for meeting those expectations, and now we want to know if it's actually working. And so we want to have very clear procedures for how we're going to monitor things. So when I'm thinking about the possibility of connecting students to various Tier 2 interventions, we want to make sure that we are very transparent in what we have to offer when we are thinking about Tier 2 supports. And we really want to support schools in being careful in those selections. You don't need a million of those. You need really good Tier 2 practices, strategies, and programs that are going to be well designed, and we're going to need to use systematic screening data to connect kids to those supports. Because honestly, if we are relying just on teacher judgment and teacher nomination, frankly, that's a lot of pressure to put on teachers. We are not trained as school psychologists or as counselors. We need to let the data drive the decision making to support that goal of equal access. And the same thing is true when we start thinking about supporting kids that have Tier 3 needs. When we think about what those options might be, we want to make sure that we're actually looking 3 times a year to see who might need what. And so that's why we're here today. We're here today to think about this idea of screening tools. And we want to share with you what is currently available in terms of systematic screening tools. And some of these are commercially available, and some of these are free access tools. And there's wonderful ones being introduced all the time, like, for example, the Sabres also, that was introduced by Stephen Killigus and Sandy Shafoulis. But as we're thinking about these systematic screening tools for today, before we get into the description of each of these, I want to talk with you for just a couple minutes about how systematic screenings occur. And many of you probably are already doing academic screenings where you're benchmarking 3 times a year to see how students are doing in reading and in math, and some of you might even be benchmarking on writing. So whereas for academic screening tools, as soon as kids come back from summer break, you can start conducting the academic screening tools, and they do require time with students. So students would read to you, you would use probes such as those designed by Ames Webb or Dibbles, and you would benchmark how students are doing at those 3 different time points. Behavior screenings are very, very, very similar with 2 main distinctions. That I want to focus on for today. Number 1, the timing of systematic screenings are different for behavior screenings. So for behavior screenings, and you would want to read the technical manuals for each of these to get their logistics, but in general, that fall screening time point does happen, as does winter, as does spring, but the fall time point does not happen as soon as kids come back from school. You actually wait 4 to 6 weeks so that you have time to let kids adjust to those routines and people get to know their behavior patterns. So the timing of that first behavior screening typically occurs 4 to 6 weeks after the school year begins. A second main consideration is that there is not time with students. So I'm not like walking up to my student and saying, Katie, are you internalizing? And then I'm writing that down. You're going to have these be completed by teachers, and they are independent ratings. So they are just one teacher's independent rating to fill out these systematic screening tools. It is very important to not have a team discussion about those, because those are not how those are built, and that's not how they are evaluated. So keeping these issues of timing in place, and again, remember, screening, means we're screening every single student, fall, 4 to 6 weeks in, right before winter break, and again, following like towards the end of the school year, about 4 to 6 weeks before the end. And it's very important to make sure that your winter time point is happening before the semester break, because if you're a secondary age student supporters, like if you're working in a middle school or high school, if you waited until January to do those screenings, students would have changed classes, and then you're going to be back to that situation where they wouldn't have had enough contact time. So keeping those big ideas in mind, what we're going to do now is we are going to start with this first systematic screening tool, and I personally consider this to be the gold standard of systematic screening, and this is called, and I want to pre-correct you on this, there's a lot of S's. So as you're looking at these tools today, know that this will be posted, and there's other resources on the SWIFT website as well as on ci3t.org that can summarize these for you. But for systematic screening for behavior disorders, this is actually the second iteration of this tool, and it's developed by Walker, Severson, and Field from University of Oregon. And prior to the second version, there used to be the SSBD and then the ESP, the Early Screening Project for preschool age students. And now this is one package that you can acquire, and it goes through, I believe, 9th grade at this time. And I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version of how this works. So imagine that you are a teacher. Let's say you're an elementary teacher and you have a roster of students. There's a paper pencil version of this, and there's also an online option for this. But basically, teachers move through this multiple gating system. And so you take all your students, and then you have your class roster. And the first thing you're doing is you are reading these descriptions of externalizing and internalizing, and then you're sorting your kids into either most like externalizing or most like internalizing. And then you are rank ordering these students in those two different groups from most like to least like. And then what you do is you fill out extra information on just the top 3 students on each of those categories. So like the top 3 shy kids, the top 3 boisterous kids are passing through that second gate, and you provide extra information on just those 6 kids. And so to do that, you do one tool that is called a critical events index. And these are huge behaviors. These are not things you would collect baseline data on. For example, some of the items are steals, sets fire, vomits after eating. Whereas the other one, the combined frequency index, is exactly the opposite. Those are low intensity, high frequency behaviors. So those actually have information on kids' adaptive behavior and maladaptive behavior. So you use these 3 different scores to kind of work through this decision tree process to see, does this student have higher than average internalizing issues or higher than average externalizing issues. And then there is a third stage that involves direct observations, but we can tell you that there's been numerous predictive validity studies now showing that teacher ratings at that second stage are highly predictive of school outcomes. These data are from some time ago, and if you look at the left-hand side of the graph in front of you, you see 3 bars under the externalizing category. And I'm showing you these dates from 2007 because I want to make it clear to you, screening is not new. Screening has been around for a while, and the good news is you can feel confident that it has been well-researched, well-established, and well-implemented. But let's take a look at this first school. In that first bar graph that you're looking at that particular elementary school, when you had the students and the externalizing list, if you will, and then the top 3 students for the externalizing behavior passed through that first gate, there were a total of 60 students that passed through that first gate. So their teacher independently completed that information on them, and when that was scored, there were 13 of those 60 kids exceeded normative criteria, which was 6% of the entire school. So now I've taken the guesswork out of knowing who has higher than average externalizing behavior challenges. That next bar represents winter that very next year. And so now keep in mind, new group of kindergartners have come in and your 5th graders have gone on to middle school. Now you'll notice that that bar is larger because the elementary school grew in size. They added a teacher. So this time there were 69 students that passed through that first gate. And now there were 7 students that exceeded normative criteria. So we dropped from 6% of the whole school to about 3.5%. And in the schools that we support, we're wanting to support them and getting that percentage to be under 5, so like between 3 and 5%. And you can see it kind of remained somewhat stable that next year. And the reason for these winter to winter comparisons or fall to fall or spring to spring is that oftentimes, based on the descriptive look we've looked at in schools, risk often increases between fall and winter and then declines a little bit in spring. And if you think about it, you're reviewing new curriculum, routines are being taught, and sometimes the newness wears off. It's kind of like for those of us who have taught for a long time, you think you're going to shave your legs every day and be fully present for teaching and wearing great clothes, and you might be rocking the same pair of jeans Monday through Thursday by the time you get to winter break. And nobody's judging you if that's the case. I sure am not. Now, on the other side of that graph, you'll see internalizing behavior challenges. And those are at the same time. So like if you notice that first green bar is winter 2007. So of those 60 kids that passed through that first gate, of those kids that had that extra information filled out, there were 17 kids that had higher than average internalizing issues, which was close to 9% of that entire student body. And that is a pattern we see of like higher than what you would expect for internalizing issues, particularly in very high performing districts. The next year, again, even though school size is increasing, which often is an indicator of increased risk, you'll see that there were now only 13 kids that next year that exceeded normative criteria, and then the following year it's down to 2.73. So you're seeing a decreasing trend in this school that was implementing a CI3T model. Now, to be clear, it's not a randomized controlled trial. You don't want to draw causal influences from this, but this is a way to descriptively look at the shifts in risk over time in your building. So those of you who are involved in writing school improvement plans and the like, this will be useful for you as you're looking at those indicators of behavioral performance in your building. For those of you who are supporting kids that have tier 2 and tier 3 needs, look at the simplicity of this. Now, rather than like a school counselor or a school psychologist walking to a teacher saying, do you have anybody that needs help? Do you have anyone? Do you have anyone? The data are going to drive these decisions. And if I'm a teacher and if I could look at the screening scores of the kids in my own class, it's going to help me to shape my instruction. If I have a large pocket of kids with internalizing issues, my desire to have open, and creative and courageous conversations about, equity issues or passionate topics might be not well received in a group of students with high levels of internalizing issues, because they may just be so terrified of, getting it wrong or being anxious about, somebody making fun of them. So you may inform your instruction by thinking about, I'm going to start by kids talking with a shoulder partner and working in small groups. But these data can be used to help drive instruction. And before we move on, I'd like to go ahead and open it up to answer any questions you might have about screening in general and also about the SSBD specifically.
And Dr. Lane, there was one question.
Sure.
Toby's asking if you ever vary that top 3 number depending on the class size.
Toby, that's a really good question. So in the technical manual, and they have a wonderful manual, very easy to follow. Then they've thought through a lot of these logistics. In general, it's 3 kids that pass through, but there is flexibility in the number of students that you can pass through. So if there's another student that is, maybe like was 4th or 5th on your list, you have a little flexibility in terms of who you can pass through that second gate. But in general, those are all normed on class sizes that close to approximate 30. But I will tell you, in our work in secondary schools, there's a lot of thought that goes into which period should be screened for exactly that reason. So for example, like last night, I was at my daughter's last open house for her senior year. So I'm officially retired from back to school nights. A little bitter, a little sweet. But I can tell you, like when her school was thinking about which period to pick for screening, because it's not that you need every student to be screened in every period by every teacher, but that was a careful consideration for those wonderful district leaders is, they didn't want to necessarily have that screening period be the same period when you had choir going, because that might be 110 students in that class. Now, they didn't pick the SSBD for the one that they were using, but you want to look to see, like in an elementary setting, is generally the homeroom teacher that does those ratings. And then in a secondary school, there's other considerations. I'm going to show you some data in a moment from a middle school that has been screening for at least the last 8 years and since then. but they consistently had it at first period. And they picked first period because in addition to their normal instructional block, there was also a 10-minute block of time on top of that, like for, attendance and advisory type time. So they picked that one. Another high school we worked with, they picked fifth period as the stable period for screening because that was literally the only period in their school day when every student was in that building, because some kids leave to go and have college and career experiences. Other kids went to voc centers. Some kids left, had a zero period, like my daughter has a zero period, so she wouldn't be there at seventh period because she's doing that early period. So there's a lot of logistics, and that's why screening isn't something we just jump out of the gate to do. We want to think carefully, because you want to make sure that every single student that is enrolled in that building, including those on an IEP, are screened 3 times a year. So great question. Are there any other questions that come up at this time for you?
I will say if you do have any questions, feel free to just list them in the chat box and we'll address them throughout.
And Susan,